You know, out in the wildest parts of the American West, where the Rocky Mountains bite into the sky like jagged teeth. Survival wasn't just about being tough, it was about being smarter than the cold that wanted to kill you. Back in 1841, a mountain man named Jacob Morrison was building himself a cabin in a hidden valley along the Cache la Poudre River in now northern Colorado. The fur trade was still booming, and Jacob had spent over 10 years trapping beaver, dodging grizzlies, and learning every trick the land had to teach him. But that summer, while everyone else was slapping together quick log shacks with dirt floors and single walls that leaked heat like a sieve, Jacob was doing something that had the other trappers laughing behind his back. He was building a wall. Not just any wall, a thick, heavy stone wall right inside his cabin, 2 feet deep, 8 feet tall, stretching 10 feet wide, positioned exactly where his cast iron stove would sit. What in the blazes is that fool doing? One old-timer snorted when he rode by, hauling rocks like a mule when he could be out setting traps. That thing gone, eat up half his living space and do nothing but gather dust. The mockery spread fast through the scattered camps. They called it Jacob's stupid wall, a waste of sweat and daylight in a place where every hour counted before the snows came. But Jacob just kept at it. His broad shoulders bent under the weight of boulders he dragged up from the riverbed one by one, fitting them together with clay mortar, he mixed by hand. He had seen too many winters where men froze in their boots, even with fires roaring, and he was done with that kind of suffering. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. On the outside, just sturdy logs, chinked with moss and mud like all the rest. But inside, that stone wall stood like a silent giant, soaking up the late summer sun during the day and holding on to it long after the shadows grew long. Jacob had learned bits and pieces from the Shoshone people he traded with. How thick earth and rock could hold warmth like a promise kept through the night. He remembered one brutal season when his old cabin dropped to near freezing by midnight, no matter how much pine he burned, and how the cold crept in through the walls like an uninvited ghost. This time would be different. He positioned the stove so its back pressed right against the stone, and he left clever little gaps at the bottom and top to let air move naturally. Pulling cold from the floor and pushing warmth up and around the room, the other men kept ribbing him every time they stopped for coffee or a pipe. "You're building a tomb in there, Jacob," they'd say, slapping their knees. "That rock's heavier than your pride, and twice as useless." But as the aspens turned gold and the nights started nipping at the edges of the days, Jacob felt something solid growing in his chest, a quiet certainty that this wall, this so-called stupid idea, was going to change everything when the real cold hit. He finished the last stones, just as the first light snow dusted the peaks, stepped back, and wiped his hands on his buckskins. The cabin looked odd, almost comical with that big gray barrier taking up space, but Jacob slept better that night than he had in years. Still, as the wind began to whisper warnings through the pines, he couldn't shake the question gnawing at him. When the blizzards came roaring down from the north and the temperature plunged so low it cracked the trees like rifle shots, would this wall be his savior? Or just another frozen mistake in a land that didn't forgive fools? Winter didn't creep in, that year it slammed the door shut with a fury that made even the toughest mountain men question their choices. By late October, the snow was already knee-deep in the valleys, and the wind howled like a wounded animal through the passes. Jacob's neighbors were chopping wood from dawn till dusk, their cabins filled with smoke and the constant crackle of fires that never quite won the battle against the cold. One trapper down the river wrote in his journal that his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the hearth, and another lost 2 toes to frostbite before the first full moon. They all burned through their woodpiles twice as fast as they expected, leaving them weak and hollow-eyed by December. But in Jacob's cabin, something almost magical was happening. The stone wall was doing exactly what he had hoped it would. When he lit the stove in the morning, the flames heated the iron, which poured that heat straight into the rock like filling a kettle. The stone drank it up, growing warm all the way through. And then, as the fire settled to glowing embers at night, it gave that warmth back slowly, steadily, radiating it into the room like the sun coming out after a storm. Jacob could sit 10 feet away in his chair, reading by lamplight or mending his traps, and feel the gentle heat washing over him without needing to stoke the fire every hour. The temperature inside stayed between 50 and 60 degrees, even when it was 40 below outside, a full 29 degrees warmer than the average in the other cabins. He was using less than half the wood the others were, and he wasn't even wearing his heavy coat most days. The secret wasn't some fancy invention. It was just plain old common sense, dressed up in stone. That wall had what folks today call thermal mass. It absorbed heat fast and let it go slow, smoothing out the wild swings that made regular cabins feel like iceboxes one minute and ovens the next. The little air gaps Jacob had built in let the warm air rise naturally and circle back down, keeping everything even without drafts that sucked the life out of a room. He had learned the hard way from years of watching how the sun baked rocks on south-facing slopes and how those same rocks stayed warm long after dark. The Shoshone women he knew from trading posts had shown him. Jacob had taken that knowledge, mixed it with his own stubbornness, and turned it into something the mountains had never seen before. Of course, the mockery hadn't stopped when the snow flew. A couple of the men snowshoed over during a break in the storms, half frozen and jealous, and stood there staring at the wall like it was a bear that had learned to talk. "You really did it, you crazy son of a gun," one said, holding his hands out to the radiating stone. "We thought you'd be dead by now." Jacob just grinned and poured them some hot coffee from the pot that stayed warm on the stove all day. But even as he shared the warmth and the stories around his fire, he knew the real test was still coming. The deepest part of that winter hit like a hammer in January of 1842, and it broke men in ways the summer sun could never imagine. For 20 straight days, the snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And the temperature dropped so low that the trappers swore the air itself was frozen. Jacob's neighbors were in real trouble now. One cabin after another went quiet as the men burned their last wood and huddled under every blanket they owned, praying for a break in the weather. A few even packed up what they could and tried to snowshoe out to the settlements, only to turn back half dead from the cold. But Jacob's cabin stayed a little island of life in that white hell. The stone wall kept working its quiet miracle, pulling heat from the stove during the short daylight hours and feeding it back through the long, black nights. Jacob would wake up warm, cook his venison stew without shivering, and even read his old Bible by the light of a single candle because the room never dipped below 45 degrees. He chopped just enough wood to keep the fire steady, and the rest of the time he spent carving new trap parts or writing notes about what the Wa was teaching him. When a break in the storms finally came and a couple of desperate trappers staggered through the snow to his door, they couldn't believe their eyes or their hands when they touched that warm stone. "Jacob, you saved us," one whispered, tears freezing on his beard. The word spread through the high country as soon as the passes opened in the spring, and by the next summer, more than a few cabins started going up with their own stone walls or thick earthen banks built the same way. Jacob Morrison lived another 30 years in those mountains, trapping and guiding and passing on what he had learned to anyone who would listen. His Wa became a legend among the old-timers, a reminder that sometimes the craziest-looking idea is the one that keeps you alive when everything else fails. He never got rich from beaver pelts, but he got something better, a name that still echoes in the stories folks tell around campfires up there. The wall itself stood for decades, until the cabin finally fell back into the land. But the idea it carried never died. It showed that paying attention to how heat really moves, trusting what the earth and the old ways could teach you, and refusing to do things the easy way could turn the deadliest winter into something you could actually live through. If you're the kind of person who loves hearing how regular folks outsmarted nature with nothing but grit and a good idea, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button if this story fired you up. Subscribe so you don't miss the next wild tale from the frontier, and tell me in the comments what stupid idea of your own ever turned out to be pure genius. Drop it down there. I read every one. Stay curious, stay warm, and I'll see you in the next one.